Good evening, Utah, and hello from our nation's capital. Welcome to Senator Lee's Tele-Townhall. Tonight, if you're on the phone and would like to ask a question, remember to press *3. We do want to hear the issues that are important to you, and we do want to make sure and get your call. So please press *3 if you're on the phone. If you're online, use the hashtag #LeeTownhall. To get things started, we want to talk a little bit about tonight's town hall. Senator, I know you've been hosting these monthly town hall events nearly every month for the past 5 years. And usually we invite Utahns from across the state to participate. In fact, it's not uncommon for tens of thousands of Utahns to tune into your town hall events each month. But recently you've decided to tailor and take a different approach and tailor these town hall forums to specific regions within the state of Utah. For example, tonight we are fielding questions from 6 different counties: Carbon, Emery, Garfield, Grand, Kane, and San Juan. Why did you decide to do this?
Well, thanks, Linda, and thanks to all of you who are joining us tonight. I enjoy all of my town hall experiences, those that are live and in person, and those that are also done telephonically, like this one. They provide me with a good opportunity to interact with voters from throughout our state to answer questions. And doing these telephone town halls is something that allows me to speak to even more people than I would otherwise be able to reach if I only did them in person. The in-person town halls will always still continue, of course. I still do those regularly as well. But these telephone town halls allow me to reach more people and to do so while I'm in Washington, as I am today. But I decided to do these regional telephone town halls for the additional reason that concerns differ from one part of the state to the other. You know, the concerns facing, for example, a cattle rancher in Garfield County might be different than the concerns of a single parent in Salt Lake County. And so this is an opportunity for me to hear from you, for me to hear about what's on your mind, for me to hear about what questions or concerns you've got with respect to the federal government, things that might uniquely impact you based on the part of the state where you live. So thanks so much for joining us, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Okay, and just a reminder, if you're on the phone and would like to ask a question, go ahead and press *3, and if you're online, use the hashtag #LeeTownhall. Our first question comes from Bailey, who has a question about economic growth in rural areas. She's from San Juan County. Bailey, you're on the line with Senator Lee.
Hello, Bailey.
Hi. I'm with the San Juan County Chamber of Commerce, and my question is, in urban areas, markets work efficiently. Let me start again. In urban areas, markets work efficiently because businesses are able to find all the things they need, from a workforce to supplies. But in rural areas, simple things like finding a qualified workforce, necessary supplies, to funding are large hurdles. How can we find ways to overcome such obstacles in rural Utah and better promote economic development and sustainability?
Okay, Bailey, thanks for that question. You ask a very insightful question. You raise a very good point, which is that people, what they really need more than anything is access to markets. When people have access to markets, they tend to prosper, and they tend to be able to get good jobs. When they don't have access to markets, to whatever degree they lack access to markets, they tend to suffer. There are some things that make it more difficult to access a free market when you live in an outlying rural area. Fortunately, there are other forces that are counteracting those today. Our transportation networks are improving. The fact that we've got internet connectivity to nearly every corner of the state allows almost anyone to operate a business from almost anywhere they want. There are, however, some obstacles that government itself is imposing on people throughout our state in a way that disproportionately affects people in rural communities, including people in Carbon, Emery, Garfield, Grand, Kane, and San Juan counties. For example, the fact that the federal government occupies as much of our land as it does in our state, in particular in these 6 counties, is a problem. The fact that the federal government owns 30% of the land mass in the United States is itself troubling enough. The fact that it owns 2/3 of the land in our state is even more troubling. And the fact that in some of these counties, where you're calling in from this evening, the federal government owns, in many cases, more than 90% of the land, creates some special problems. including the fact that although your county government is responsible for providing search and rescue services, police, security services, providing educational opportunities for your residents, it can't tax most of the land. It can't collect property tax on most of the land because most of it is owned by the federal government. And if this land were owned by basically anyone else, first of all, no one else would be able to own that much land in any one part of our state or in any one part of the country. If they did, it would be troubling. But it's even more troubling when it's the government, and then the government declares itself beyond the authority of the county to collect taxes. So as a result of this, Congress has come up with a program called PILT, which stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes. The idea is that Congress is trying to offset in some way the lack of revenue that you have locally as a result of the fact that so much of your land is owned by the federal government. The problem with this is that throughout most of Utah, PILT covers only a few cents on the dollar compared to what you would get elsewhere, compared to what the county would be able to collect if the county could actually tax that land. I'm trying to change that, and I've got legislation that would give the counties the right to collect the property tax equivalent of that land. And that would help your county develop more of its infrastructure, develop more of what it needs to do in order to serve people well, in order to deliver access to markets. That needs to change. We also need to pass the Public Lands Initiative, the PLI program that Rob Bishop has spearheaded and that I'm sponsoring in the Senate, which would open up our land so that we can actually use it, so that we can actually realize the dream of multiple use, so that we can use appropriate lands for energy exploration and development, for recreational purposes in other cases, and that we'll have expeditious handling of applications for drilling permits. We'll be able to use our land for what we need. These are some of the real market advantages that many of these 6 counties have, is that you've got access to some of the most beautiful territory in the entire world. People want to come there and visit, but we need to be able to use the land for its intended purpose. The Public Lands Initiative legislation would help us to do that. In order to achieve that, we also need a broader regulatory reform, which we'll be discussing more later during this Tele-Townhall. But needless to say, our federal regulations are proving to be especially burdensome, not just for the American people generally, but especially for Utahns, and particularly Utahns living in rural communities.
All right, and just a reminder to everyone that's still joining the call, if you're on the phone and would like to ask a question, go ahead and press *3, and if you're online, use the hashtag #LeeTownhall. We're going to go to Monticello next, where Blaine has a question about Congressman Bishop's lands bill. Blaine, you're on the line with Senator Lee.
Hello, Blaine.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. Appreciate you visiting with us today.
You bet.
Yeah. So my question was right along what you were getting started in on there. I'm a farmer here in the Monticello San Juan area, and also part of the Farm Bureau, the local Farm Bureau here. And so, yeah, since this lands bill initiative that you mentioned that Rob Bishop started, I know it's changed a lot, and I don't know that we would even recognize it as what it was when it was first presented to us a couple years ago. But I was wondering if you could just fill us in on a little more detail on where we are on that, where you stand with it, and what that's going to do for us with this ultimate goal of getting these federal lands turned over to the states and getting control of them.
Okay, thank you, Blaine. First of all, one of the things this does is to protect grazing rights. So many Utahns, particularly Utahns in your part of the state, are struggling with the fact that the federal government is inconsistent in how it treats people who operate on grazing leases. I'm sure this is an important issue to you and to many people that you know. The PLI legislation would help protect those rights. It would also help protect energy development, protect access to recreational uses on federal public lands. The idea behind this is to address in the affected counties those uses that have been identified as appropriate uses for the land in question. Now, look, I want to be very clear. We're not talking about opening up national parks for drilling. That's not what we're dealing with here. We're talking about land that is just sort of garden variety BLM land, but that can be used and probably should be used for energy exploration and development, in some cases for recreational uses in others. In other cases still, we've identified other lands as lands that deserve some degree of protection from use, that need to be protected by federal law so that they remain more or less untrammeled by man. But in each instance, we're identifying what the land is, and we're undertaking a policy that would be more consistent with the interests of the people of our state. You see, for too long, these decisions have been made at the regulatory level, at the administrative bureaucrat level, and ultimately made by people who are not Utahns and who have no permanent lasting bond or connection with our land. People who answer to those based in Washington, D.C. and not based in Utah. What we're trying to do is to gain input, as we have throughout this process, from citizens throughout our state on what our land use needs are relative to federal public land. Now, I do believe that this is a shorter term exercise, one that will open up some land right now that is currently off limits to certain activities that are appropriate, whether it's grazing or energy development or recreation or something else. I think a more intermediate solution is the one I referred to a few minutes ago, is legislation that would entitle taxing jurisdictions within the state, in the case of our state, counties, to collect at their choosing the property tax equivalent of what they would receive if this land were in private ownership. Then there's a long-term solution, which I'm also pushing for, which would involve widespread transfer of federal public land ownership and management authority over to the state of Utah. I believe that these decisions long-term need to be made at the state level, and that it's simply wrong, it's inconsistent with the vision and the structure of our constitutional republic to have this much of our land owned and managed by a government that is thousands of miles from the people affected by those decisions.
Okay, there's still several of you joining us this evening. We're excited to have you. If you would like to ask a question to Senator Lee and you're on the phone, press *3. And if you're online, use the hashtag #LeeTownhall. We're going to go to Emery County next, where Ethan has a question about the EPA. Ethan, you're on the line with Senator Lee.
Hello, Ethan.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for taking my question tonight. It has to do with the EPA. Recently, they just released some more regulations on coal-fired power plants in conjunction with the coal moratorium that Secretary of Interior Sally Jewell just announced. What is your perspective on that, and what are you and your colleagues doing behind the scenes to maybe help curb the effects?
Okay, I'm happy to answer that question. This is an important one, and this has been an issue that's been very troubling to me. First of all, thank you for your service as a commissioner. I've often said that the best government happens at the most local level, and I believe that's certainly true in the case of county commissioners. So thank you for your service, and thanks for your question tonight. Look, I, like you, have long lived in a state where I can walk into a room and turn on a light switch and the light comes on. And the power that is involved in that process is affordable and reliable. That is the case in large measure to a very considerable degree because of our abundant supply of coal. Coal provides us with an abundant, consistent, storable, and clean, abundant source of electric power. So I'm very troubled by these steps that the administration has taken with increasing frequency and aggressiveness to shut down the coal industry in the United States. Here's the problem, though, Commissioner. The problem is, it's often said that possession is 9/10 of the law. That is unfortunately true with respect to our federal government in Washington, D.C., because over the years, Congress has voluntarily surrendered so much of its authority. It's handed over this vast array of discretion to executive branch bureaucrats and to the president and his administration to make these decisions. Now, I believe that President Obama and his administration are overreaching in this circumstance, but there are unfortunately a lot of reasons why it's going to be difficult to overturn them in that process. Now, when they take a step like this, there are a few things that Congress can do. One of them involves withholding funding for that executive action. I would hope and expect that we would have a serious discussion about withholding funding for the implementation of these measures that would halt the coal industry, at least to a significant degree, as it relates to our federal public lands. Based on recent experiences, though, and the fact that Congress has been unwilling to, notwithstanding the pleading of many of us, Congress hasn't been doing this. Congress hasn't been utilizing its power of the purse, and it's one of the reasons why I've been pushing for broader, deeper regulatory reform. One of the reasons why I'm kicking off the Article 1 project here in Washington. We'll be announcing that on Wednesday. It's basically an internal think tank within Congress where we're going to be coming together with a big picture vision toward reclaiming Congress's authority. See, what's happened is that over time, for the last 7 or 8 decades, Congress, under the leadership of both political parties, has given up too much power. We'll pass laws with broad sweeping mandates that saying things like, we shall have clean air, and then we hereby delegate to the EPA the power to make and enforce rules that are effectively laws that define what clean air is, define what pollution is, and punish polluters. They then have the power to enforce those same regulations. We do that with land use issues a lot too. We give enormous discretion to the Secretary of the Interior, in this case, Secretary Jewell, to manage federal public lands in a manner that she deems consistent with the overall mandate of multiple use and with the interest of the public. The problem with that is that when we don't provide enough details, we lead ourselves in a very vulnerable position in which executive branch bureaucrats can come in and just do whatever they want. It's one of the reasons why we need to pass the REINS Act. The REINS Act, REINS in this setting stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. I'm an original co-sponsor of the REINS Act in the Senate, and what the REINS Act says, in essence, is that anytime a federal regulatory agency undertakes a new action, if it's a major rule that it's creating, one that would have a significant economic impact, it cannot take effect without Congress first affirmatively enacting it into law and the President signing it into law. This way, actions like the one you described would need to be passed into law by Congress. And as is the case here, I don't think Congress would end up passing something saying we're effectively going to shut down the coal industry in America, or at least the coal industry insofar as it depends on access to federal public lands. Unfortunately, until we get some deep, lasting, meaningful regulatory reforms like this in place, we will continue to exist at the whim of executive branch bureaucrats, presidents, and their cabinets as they force decisions like these on us. I don't think they have the authority to do it. But until we get deep, lasting, meaningful regulatory reform, we're going to continue to be subject to these kinds of things. I'm sure there will be litigation over it. Whether that litigation will come to fruition or bring about a successful result in time for it to matter before this president leaves office remains to be decided. But that's why we need this reform.
Okay, and there's still a number of you hopping on the call with us tonight. We want to give a special welcome to Carbon High School. We know that there are a few government and history classes with teachers and students participating in the Town Hall Forum tonight. So we want to welcome you and everyone that's on the phone. If you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and press *3. And if you're online, please use the hashtag #LeeTownHall. Our next question was submitted online from David. He's from Blanding, and his question is, we fear that President Obama can unilaterally create national monuments under the Antiquities Act. Is there anything that can be done to prevent this?
David, I'm so glad you asked that question. I am in the process, I've introduced legislation in the Senate that would restrict President Obama's ability to do that. My legislation would say that anytime the president tries to declare or designate a new monument, that monument authority would be temporary only, and that within a defined period of time, no more than 3 years, that would expire unless both Congress and the host state's legislature both approved the action and said, yes, we want this monument, and they both designated it together, then the president's monument designation would disappear within that period. I think that gives us our best chance of limiting and reining in this president's authority, or any president's authority. Now look, when the Antiquities Act was passed just over a century ago, I don't think anyone contemplated monument designations of the size or the nature that we had with the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, where we had close to 1 million acres designated as a national monument, where you had a president acting in such a way as to create de facto wilderness without having to go through Congress to do so. I want to do anything and everything I can to discourage this president from creating a national monument without the buy-in of the host state and of the communities that are affected by it. And I also think the people's elected representatives in Congress and in the state legislature need to have a say in this, and that's why I've introduced this legislation. I'm pleased to report that as a member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, I've been able to work out a deal in which we're going to have a vote on this probably tomorrow on my legislation. I'm attaching it as an amendment to an energy bill that's moving through the Senate chamber this week, and I expect to vote on this measure tomorrow. So keep a lookout for that, and I'd appreciate your support for that legislation if you agree with it. You can look at it at my website at lee.senate.gov. But I just heard from Lisa Murkowski. She's the chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, on which I serve, and she let me know that we will likely be getting a vote on this tomorrow.
Okay, and just a reminder, if you're on the phone and would like to ask a question this evening, go ahead and press *3. We do want to hear your questions. We do want to get to it. And if you're online, use the hashtag #LeeTownHall. Our next caller is from Castledale, and her name is Lauren. She has a question about the coal industry. Lauren, you're on the line with Senator Lee.
Hello, Lauren.
Hi, this is he, Lauren.
Oh.
Senator, thank you for this opportunity. I work for Rocky Mountain Power.
Yes.
My current position is managing director for power plant. How do you see the coal industry and its supply chains affected by continued environmental factors? And what are you doing to address job and economic impact in Utah?
Okay. Steve, I'm glad you raised this issue, and this is consistent with so many of the other questions we've been getting tonight. This deals with this administrative bureaucracy culture that has developed in Washington. Sometimes when people describe it within Congress, they make it sound as if Congress were the victim in this. In fact, Congress is the perpetrator of this problem. Congress is the problem. Congress has chosen to delegate away its authority in such a way as to give unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats within the federal government very broad discretion to basically shut down coal. So this administration has pledged to do that. It has been consistently wrong in my opinion, but consistent in saying basically it wants to shut down coal in America. Now this is wrong. We can't allow this to happen, not only because I believe they're really exceeding their authority statutorily and constitutionally in doing this, but also because it's so contrary to our economic interests in the United States. Now look, I'm an all of the above guy when it comes to energy. In addition to coal, we also need natural gas. In many parts of the country, we'll continue to need nuclear power, geothermal power, wind, solar, hydroelectric, geothermal, you name it, I'm for it. But there's nothing quite like coal in terms of its abundance, its affordability, its reliability. There's nothing quite like coal in that we can store it in one location, right next to the power plant, for many, many months at a time. I mean, you can create a huge mountain of coal such that if supply chains are interrupted, you can continue to generate electric power on site, even if your production lines go down for a while. You can't do that with natural gas, not like you can with coal. It's one of the reasons why I'm determined to continue to protect coal. I've supported legislation in the Senate that would undo significant parts of President Obama's war on coal. Unfortunately, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are many respects in which occupying the White House is reminiscent of this idea that possession is 9/10 of the law. There's a lot they can get away with, particularly in President Obama's last year in office, just because it will take a lot of time to undo through litigation or through congressional action some of the affirmative steps being taken by this administration to harm the coal industry. But please know that we're doing everything we can, everything within our power to undo that. What I'm going to propose is that the next time we have an opportunity to pass spending legislation, I would like to see us withhold funding for the implementation of any of these programs that are designed specifically to kill the coal industry. I think our commitment to the American people requires nothing less than that, and I'd like to see that. We will also continue to have votes, as we have already a couple times in the last year, on what are known as resolutions of disapproval, where we will vote on a particular measure, a particular administrative rule that's designed to hurt coal in an attempt to stop it. If we can get a resolution of disapproval passed by both houses of Congress and signed into law by the President, it undoes the action. But therein lies the problem. When the Congressional Review Act was passed into law just over 20 years ago, they didn't go far enough. And what they should have done is pass something much more similar to the RAINS Act, which I described a few minutes ago. In other words, the default proposition ought to be that the new rule or regulation in question, whether it's designed to hurt coal or do something else, the default proposition needs to be that it doesn't take effect. Absent congressional action, it shouldn't take effect because it's a new law. And my copy of the Constitution, in the very first clause of the first section of the first article, says that all legislative powers herein granted, meaning all power to make law within the federal government, shall be vested in a Congress, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Now, the last time I checked, the EPA was not mentioned as having legislative powers, nor was the Department of the Interior. They don't have the power to make law, only Congress has that. So we've got to stop delegating that power away so as to create the false impression that they've got the power to do this. If we would reclaim that power, they couldn't get away with it. That's why we need deep, lasting, meaningful regulatory reform, the likes of which could be achieved through passage of the RAINS Act, of which I'm an original co-sponsor in the Senate. Significantly, Steve, the RAINS Act has passed each year, every year, for the last 3 or 4 years in a row in the House of Representatives. Tragically, despite my best efforts to do so, we have not been able to achieve a single vote, a single up or down vote in the United States Senate on the RAINS Act, and I'm going to try to get that changed this year.
Okay, and just a reminder, if you're on the phones and would like to ask a question to Senator Lee, go ahead and press *3, and if you're online, use the hashtag #LeeTownHall. Our next question was submitted online from Lance in Moab, and his question is, recently both parties put forward spending bills that included ideological riders being attached that harmed our communities, families, and environments. These riders have no place in must-pass spending legislation. What can be done to change this process?
Okay, Lance. The first thing that needs to change there is that we've got to stop governing by cliff. When we govern by cliff, that's when we set an arbitrary deadline by which we say, okay, spending bill X has to be passed by date Y. And then when we fail to undertake the normal funding process for the government, that is to say, when we don't follow the Budget Act of 1974, which contemplates that after passing a budget, which we did last year for the first time in 6 years, that Congress is supposed to pass 12 separate spending bills, at least 12 separate bills, each dealing with a different aspect of government. One, for example, to fund the Pentagon and military operations. Another one to fund transportation projects. Another one to fund veterans programs, and so on and so forth until all the federal government is funded. Unfortunately, we didn't do that last year. After passing a budget, we had members of the Senate who blocked consideration of those itemized appropriations bills, and we got to the end of the fiscal year with no funding mechanism in place. And so as a result, what you had were 4 members of Congress, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, went behind closed doors and they worked out a bill that was 2,242 pages long. Now, yeah, of course, there were some appropriations writers in there, and I understand your concern with those, but I don't believe those are the problem. I think those are perhaps a symptom of the problem, and I think you and I are perhaps perceiving some of the same problem. The underlying problem is that Congress isn't doing its job. Congress isn't keeping the government funded as it was intended to do. In other words, we're supposed to be funding it through at least 12 different spending bills so that you're never putting funding for the entire government on the table at one time. As long as we have a constitutional republic, there will always be policy writers attached to spending bills. But the problem that we had with the legislation you described is that we received this 2,242 page spending bill that, depending on how you measured it, spent either a little over $1 trillion or a little under $2 trillion. It was presented to us as a simple take it or leave it proposition, a binary choice, a yes or no question, 48 hours before we were called upon to vote on it. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it a little bit difficult to read 2,242 pages within 48 hours. And keep in mind, this doesn't read like a fast-paced fictional work of fiction or a novel. This is incredibly detailed legislative text. Nonetheless, I and members of my team split it up and we read it aggressively over the next 48 hours after we got it. Unfortunately, I didn't see significant improvements to the way our government operates. And I didn't feel comfortable voting for it because it was negotiated in secret without the input of all but 4 members of Congress. In other words, there are 100 senators, 98 of them were excluded. There are 435 representatives, all but 2 of them, so 433 of them were excluded. That means upwards of 300 million Americans were effectively excluded from the process, not just their representatives, but the people they represent, because of the fact that this was negotiated in secret. Here's what I'm getting at. The biggest single problem that we've got with our spending process is that we wait to the last minute and then we don't allow input. Even if they're going to spend all in one bill, it's not the ideal way of doing it, but even if they did it that way, if they at least left several weeks for Congress to debate it and discuss it, and for individual members to offer up amendments, and to have those debated and discussed in the full view of the American people with all the transparency that is warranted under those circumstances, then at least the American people would have a voice in the process. That I see as the biggest problem, and that's what we're trying to change. That's the whole reason. It's a very significant part of the reason why I've started this Article 1 project that we'll be launching formally this week, this internal think tank within Congress. It's designed to not to achieve any particular substantive policy outcome, but to restore the procedural protections in the Constitution, restore the functionality contemplated in our founding document that guarantees that the American people will have input into the process by which their government operates.
Okay, we want to welcome everyone still joining the call. If you're on the phones, go ahead and press *3 to ask a question. And if you're online, please use the hashtag #LeeTownhall. We're going to go to another question that was submitted online. Commissioner Polak from Garfield County was hoping to be with us tonight, but travel prevented him from doing so. And his question is, he would like to know what could be done about the Dixie National Forest closing 75% of the forest by executive order of President Obama. He feels this will have a devastating effect on the county and that the Forest Service is more powerful than Congress and that something needs to be done about this imbalance of power.
Great. First of all, I'm very glad Commissioner Pollock was able to raise that important question. This is exactly consistent with the other things I've been describing tonight, where we've simply given too much power to administrative bureaucracies. There are, I believe, 2 protections in the Constitution that are as important as, perhaps more important than, any other protection in the Constitution. They're the structural protections. One is vertical and the other horizontal. The vertical protection is one that we call federalism, the simple understanding that most of the power should remain close to the people at the state and the local level. People most affected by laws should be those making the determinations. So local decisions ought to be made locally. In fact, most government decisions are local, except for those that are carved out by the Constitution and made national, made the province of the federal government. The other protection is horizontal, where within the federal government, within the limited powers given to the federal government, we've got one branch, the legislative branch, Congress, where I work, that is supposed to make the laws. Another branch, the executive branch, headed by the president, it's supposed to implement, execute, and enforce the laws made by Congress. And then you've got the judicial branch, the courts, whose job it is to interpret the laws where their meaning is in dispute. In this particular instance, what Commissioner Pollack has described cuts to the heart of both our neglect of the vertical separation of powers that we call federalism, and also the horizontal separation of powers. We have decisions being made nationally that should be made locally about federal public land, and then those policy decisions, which really are determinations of law. They're establishing policy rather than just executing and implementing and enforcing the will of Congress. They're newly promulgated policies by the executive branch. We've neglected those horizontal separation of powers as well. And that's why we need, first of all, to have a short-term, medium-term, and long-term solution to deal with the public lands problem. Short-term, I think we need to pass the Public Lands Initiative, spearheaded by Rob Bishop, that I'll be sponsoring in the Senate. And in the medium term, I think we need to enact PILT reform to guarantee that counties will be able to collect the rough property tax equivalent of what they could collect if federal public lands were in private ownership. And then the long-term view is that we need to transfer federal public lands over to state ownership and state management. And then, again, we need to pass the REINS Act so as to deal with this horizontal separation of powers problem, where you've got executive branch bureaucrats making determinations that ought to be made by Congress.
Okay, and for those of you still joining us, if you're on the phone and would like to ask a question, remember to press *3, and if you're online, use the hashtag #LeeTownHall. We're going to go to Howard next on the phones, and he has a question about national parks. Howard, you're on the line with Senator Lee.
Hello, Howard.
I appreciate it.
Hello, Howard.
I live in Moab, Utah, where Arches National Park probably helps create $1 billion tourist industry in this community. And in general, it seems that your support of national parks isn't that high as far as I can see on your voting record. Since you represent us in this state, what are you going to do to make the national parks better for the guests that visit them? Arches, I can tell you, is overrun with visitors, and they don't have the money to do the improvements necessary to make it an experience for the visitors.
Yeah, thanks for your question. First of all, one of the most important things that we can do with respect to the national parks and improving the user experience for them is to deal with the maintenance backlog. Our national park system is something that so many Americans enjoy, and with good reason. They've got a significant maintenance backlog. This is not the fault of the American people. This is the fault of the U.S. Department of the Interior and the U.S. Congress. But there is a maintenance backlog, and so I support the national parks and the economic activity that they create. I love Arches National Park as well as the other national parks we've got in our state. And so, and that's one of the reasons why I've been concerned with the fact that some in Congress are bent on the permanent reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund without significant reforms that would help us deal with this national parks maintenance backlog. The federal government and federal agencies can't manage the land that they've got. And if they can't manage the land that they've got by dealing with the maintenance backlog, we shouldn't be putting in place mechanisms that would enable the federal government to acquire even more land. And so that's an important issue to me, and one that I'm going to continue to fight for, because I love our national parks, and I want to make sure that we maintain them as they need to be maintained, so that they can be enjoyed not only by us and our generation, but our children and their children and grandchildren after them.
Okay, and if you're on the phone and would like to ask a question, remember to press *3. We do want to hear your questions tonight, and if you're online, please use the hashtag #LeeTownHall. Our next question was submitted online from Drew. He's concerned about the negative impact of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument since its designation by executive order of President Clinton. The population of the high school has dropped dramatically. There are few life-sustaining jobs and programs are being cut. Please, no more monuments.
Yeah, look, you're preaching to the choir on that one, at least insofar as you're talking about a similar unilateral presidential act of a massive sweeping monument of the sort that will fundamentally change the economic and cultural landscape of our state. It's, again, one of the reasons why I've introduced this legislation that would put a time limit on the president's authority to designate a monument, and one that would cause the presidential declaration and designation of a national monument to expire within a finite period of time, absent congressional approval and state legislative approval of the monument in question. And again, for any of you who weren't on the call at the time I mentioned it, I've not only introduced this legislation, but as of just a few minutes before this call started, as a member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee here in the Senate, a committee I serve on, I was able to get a commitment from our committee chair, Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, that will be voting on my legislation as part of an amendment to an energy bill that is on the floor of the Senate this week. If you want to look at that legislation, you can go to my website at lee.senate.gov.
Okay, we have time for one more question. We're going to go over to Blanding, where Gary has a question about voter identification. Gary, you're on the line with Senator Lee.
Hello, Gary.
Thank you. Senator Lee, you're a specialist in that in the Constitution. My question in that is, with all the illegals, we got 12 million illegals and then in the country and that now, what is the big controversy about having people identified with some type of identification to be able to vote? And what's to preclude them from voting?
Okay, thank you for your question, Gary. First of all, typically, voting and elections are managed by state governments rather than by the federal government. That is how they operate. In other words, it's state officials, not federal officials, that manage elections, that manage voting booths, and that typically are those responsible for setting up procedures to determine voter eligibility. So it would typically be up to a state to decide what measures, if any, need to be put in place to make sure that voter fraud isn't being carried out. Some states have chosen to require identification for voters when they show up. I think this makes sense. Every time I go to vote, I produce my driver's license as I'm asked, consistent with the way we do things in Utah. That's so that we can guarantee that I am who I say I am, and that I'm not trying to vote multiple times, or that I'm not trying to vote if I don't have the right to do so. It just makes a lot of sense. Now look, for somewhat similar reasons, we're now asked to provide identification when we go to the doctor's office. We're asked to provide identification when we show up to the airport to go on a plane. We're asked to provide identification when we drive on a public road, because if we get pulled over, we'll be asked to produce our driver's license, which identifies us. It's with good reason that we're asked to produce identification in these and other circumstances, including when we travel outside the United States and we want to come back in. We have to produce our passport, showing yet again that we are who we say we are. It makes perfect sense that we would do so in the context of elections and voting. And yet there are those who insist that this somehow is wrong, that this somehow violates some federal civil right, that it is somehow going to be used in a discriminatory way. There is nothing discriminatory at all about somebody requiring somebody to prove that they are who they say they are in order to guarantee that the American people aren't defrauded. Sadly, the Justice Department in the Obama administration has undertaken action against several states who have adopted measures like these to protect themselves against voter fraud. I think this is wrong. As a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I've questioned those officials who have undertaken these actions because I think they're dead wrong. I think a state has every right to ask voters to identify themselves and to provide some proof of their identity when they're going to be voting. It's not the business of the federal government to interfere with that. There are those on the other side of the debate who like to respond to all of this by saying, okay, but what if any instances of voter fraud can you actually prove? And if you can't prove that there are widespread instances of voter fraud in this part of the country or that, then you shouldn't be able to do anything like this. I think that's entirely the wrong way of looking at it. Because first of all, voter fraud by its very nature is really, really difficult to prove. Once somebody has cast their vote, that vote goes into the system. It's not necessarily going to be an easy thing to ferret out. It's much easier to prevent it in the first place by requiring people to identify themselves. In any event, I believe that this is a state decision and not a federal one. I don't believe this is an issue the federal government ought to be deciding. I think the federal government ought not be either requiring the production of identification or prohibiting it. I think it ought to be up to each state to decide on its own. And so that's how I view it. For whatever it's worth, I do tend to support those states that decide to require it because, once again, this is just what we do as Americans when it's really important to ensure that somebody is who they say they are. We require ID, and I don't think there's anything un-American about that.
Okay, we do want to thank everyone that was able to join us tonight, whether you were on the phone or online. Senator, I'm going to go ahead and hand the time over to you as we close. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what constituent services are available and how the people of Utah can stay connected to you and what you're working on.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you from Carbon, Emery, Garfield, Grand, Kane, and San Juan counties who have joined us tonight. It's been a pleasure to visit with you to hear what some of your concerns are. I want each of you to know that you've got a friend, an ally, and an advocate in Washington, and it's an honor and a privilege for me to serve you. Please know also that I have a staff here in Washington and also in Utah, a staff full of men and women who are hardworking, who know the ins and outs of the federal government, including and especially the federal agencies with which many of you have to interact, who can help you. And I'd like to offer up their services anytime we can be of help. Please feel free to call my office. You can either call us in Washington at 202-224-5444 or at our Salt Lake office at 801-524-5933. You can also visit our website at lee.senate.gov where you can follow the links to send us a message or to request assistance from a member of my staff in dealing with a federal agency or dealing with any kind of problem rising under federal law. But if this service is there for you, please reach out anytime we can be of help to you. We want to make sure that you get the kind of government that you want, that you need, and that as an American citizen you certainly deserve. We do live in a time of great problems, great challenges, but it's also a time of great opportunity. And I believe that as Americans, we'll see that our best days remain yet ahead of us. We do the right thing as Americans, not because of who we are, but because of what we do, because we choose freedom again and again. And I'd like to invite each of you to join me in that quest to re-embrace freedom, re-embrace the protections that come from following the protections of the U.S. Constitution, of restoring the vertical protections that we call federalism and the horizontal protections that we call separation of powers. Thank you for joining me tonight. May God bless the United States of America.
Have a good night, everyone.